Cool. Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Snapp Tech Podcast. I'm again with Enrique. Today we're going to be talking about SDKs, SDK development and so on. I think a good place to start is to ask, what is an SDK?
Let's start from the beginning, right? Well, when we're talking about an SDK, we're talking about the entire product that we deliver as an interface, as a final contract to end users that are going to integrate this into their application. So we're basically packing some functionality that gets delivered. We can discuss later, and we'll discuss later, whether as a native framework, multi-platform framework, technology, underlying technology. But this is different from just a library. An artifact that you're downloading and integrating into your application. The SDK is the entire product. Here we're talking about important things such as documentation that you generate, the final product, the APIs, the contracts that you're talking with, the actual library. So we're talking about this full entity that external applications are going to integrate in order to access your product. So I guess everybody that is watching the video has probably integrated things such as Firebase SDK, right, from Google or some other types of SDKs.
Okay. Can I ask you to get started a little bit of your background? Because I think for the audience it's important to understand why we are talking about it. So can you tell a little bit some things that you've done in this area?
Well, me personally, I have been for a very long time contributing to open source projects, mostly in the Android ecosystem, but recently, last year, we contributed from Snapp to React Native 0.81. I personally have been contributing at Google Maps, the open source libraries, AOSP. We contributed for Deutsche Bahn on an SDK that was facilitating the display of routes to connect from one point to the other one when you're in a platform A and you want to go to the platform B with, well, some graphic functionality. At other automotive clients, I think that's your piece of cake. We have been also contributing and generating SDKs that have been using internally. So we've been doing this intensively, privately, open source, and for some of our clients.
And so my side, you mentioned I've been doing automotive, but we built a product, this kind of Android Automotive OS Foundation Development Kit. It's meant for things that people can take the foundation and build on top of that one. So in our case, the whole operating system has become a kind of SDK, but it also has smaller SDKs like a company and app development SDK and all of those kind of things. So we've done a lot of in this kind of area. The other thing, you and I are involved in this kind of similar areas, is that we both run communities here in Munich. I run the Android community, you do the Kotlin community. The people who come into these meetups, they often talk about SDKs, but mainly they are the clients of an SDK as well, right? So this is another side that we've been doing, right?
Exactly. So there are two sides to an SDK. Obviously, you as a consumer are going to take different decisions, and well, your priorities are different than when you are creating an SDK. And when you are creating an SDK, we talk about different aspects that are very relevant. Something that I wasn't fully aware until I started working on an SDK that had a large audience and was being used by a large number of people, was the how to protect your users from breaking changes, which is something that if you develop for a company, right, it might not be very relevant. I don't know, you're developing for company A, you have, let's say like 50, 100 developers that are integrating your SDK. It's very important, but you can afford to have breaking changes because you're going to notify them that, hey, the API is changing, you just need to, this function is not going to work anymore, you just need to use a different attribute, and that's fine. But when you have, let's say like dozens of thousands of users, you need to think that this is going to be disruptive because typically your SDK is going to be published on a repository, either Cocoa Pods or Maven or whatever. And the next version, if it breaks your current code base, is an incommodity for users. So you need to manage many aspects that are not common from as a client integrating the SDK, but only as a designer or a creator of an SDK.
But this brings in the interesting area. So we can talk about API design a little bit later. But the idea of when you are building an SDK, your users, the developers who are going to use your SDK, they're going to depend on the feature you build. So they use your SDK because it's easier to use your SDK than build the feature themselves, right? It might be because they don't know how to do it. It might be because they have no proprietary access to some code that they need, or it's simply faster. to do so. And we as developers, we want to reuse code, and SDK is one of the core way to reuse code, right? It's a reusable module and all of those kind of things. But when we start building a new one, we need to think a lot about the stuff that you talk about, the distribution and so on. So how do you get started with this kind of thing? So often in software project, you don't have a very clear goal in the end. So you don't have you kind of know a little bit what you want to do, you know what you want to achieve, but you don't know how you want to achieve it. So it's quite easy to go and just build some stuff that might not be what you want to do in the end, that might be different from that one. So how do you get started? How do you go from, experimental, stable, beta, alpha distribution? How do you get people to try your things? Because the reason I'm talking about this, we had an experience with one client where we were building internal SDK for the client and the other teams inside the client. And it was a relatively big build. There was about 1,000 people using the SDK in the client. And we encountered a problem where we were building it, the first versions we were building, and we needed to understand how our users, the developers, were using it, so we can best serve them. But that requires us iterating things, and that required breaking changes, that required us being able to put betas out there. But the teams were really reluctant to take our beta SDKs or alpha SDKs, really, because they said, well, we don't want to mesh our development. But what happens if they don't mesh their development in early phases, then the actual final release is going to be early release. Then there's not going to be iterations to improve that one. How do you get people to try things that might break in the future? And what point you're going to go, like, okay, now I'm not going to break anything anymore? How do you manage this?
It's very interesting because it's this old discussion of whether we create a problem or we create a solution and then try to find the problem, right? So the problem needs to be clearly defined. I've never trusted into, I think this is a solution for a problem that I haven't found. In general, and in my experience, that doesn't work. So you are just in search of a problem that might exist, might not. So generally, SDKs are packed towards a problem that is existing. It has been reproduced many times, and it's visible. So you can see that, okay, using this, there are like certain difficulties to use this underlying library, for example, or to connect with this API or to provide this functionality. We have seen this at different teams. That's the first thing that you need to have in mind. In my experience, very important also is to be super opinionated and having very strong principles when developing an SDK. One of the core problems I have seen, and that has been at very different open source projects I have been working with, is trying to solve many problems. When you start with an idea that makes sense, and this is the problem we're trying to solve, and the first iterations towards that SDK are fixing that problem, are improving it, are building like some sort of a helper layer around it. But then you start getting issues, feature requests, right? It would be nice if we can do this thing that is not very related to the initial core of the problem. And then you just start branching and end up with something that is not very similar to the initial thing that you were thinking of, but something that has branched too much. I think that detracts from solving the original problem. For example, at the Google Maps libraries, one of the core principles was we are going to reflect the underlying SDK. Nothing else, nothing more. This is the thing that we're trying to solve. And there were many feature requests to, hey, it would be nice if we can introduce this feature that is not originally supported in the underlying SDK, but could be nice. You think it's reasonable. I think also as a technical person, you think it's feasible to implement this thing, right? Like I know it's going to be like this function here, modifying this class, expanding this function. But the principle was, is this supported by the underlying SDK? If the answer is no, we are not implementing this, because then you end up losing focus and losing the guiding principle. This, in general, needs to apply for every single SDK. It could be like a private SDK for a company that is only being used internally. It could be an SDK that a company is offering to connect to their APIs and services, whatever.
So this brings an interesting point to this discussion, which I keep thinking about this a lot. I keep referring the developers who use SDK, that's our users, right? And you talk about feature development and so on. There's a lot of parallels of normal UX development of an application or a system. So when you build software, you need to make sure you don't bloat it with features. There's what we talk a lot about in the UX design, saying, goal-driven development or user-centered development. So every feature you put in the software should be inherited from a real user goal. So user want to do something with your software, you put features in that support that goal or those goals that you defined. If a feature goes in there without supporting a goal, that's bloat and that's going to complicate the system, and there's no point putting it there. So it sounds to me a little bit like a software and SDK development requires a similar way of thinking. You shouldn't bloat the SDK, you should have focus on it, right?
Exactly. For me, one of the questions I ask myself, or one of the things I have been developing over time, I have to say at the beginning in my career, probably the focus was different, was more, if this is attainable or if this is doable, then let's do it. But over time, I guess you start being more conservative on a way and thinking that just because something can be implemented, it does not means that need to be implemented. A problem that arises immediately is that new features need maintenance.
Yeah.
They need, you need to make an active effort to keep the lights on.
Okay, so one thing that developers don't seem to understand, that if you add a feature, it adds complexity to everything that already is there. So an added feature is exponentially complicating the whole system. Because like you said, you have to maintain all of them. Now you have one more thing to maintain. And also there's no such thing as, risk-free change in general. Like software developers quite often go, okay, well, I just changed this string here. There's no way it breaks anything. And then it turns out you can't log into the software anymore, right? And the same thing might happen in here. You add things in there. And from UX perspective, every feature added to a software always makes all the other features more difficult to find. And the same applies for API or SDK as well, right? So you need to be quite careful. You have to be focused and think about. One example I would like to bring up, I always bring up when I say good SDKs and good API development or design, is Google Firebase. At least it used to be. Now it's become a little bit bloated. But in the early phases of Google Firebase, and I know, because I know some people who worked on it, that they used user-centered design principles to create the APIs, and they did user testing, developer testing with the APIs, and they changed the APIs. And I have an experience with Google Firebase, especially in Android, where I don't need to read the documentation. The API on the course were there where I expected them to be. I just stopped typing in, and oh, that's it. That's exactly what I was looking for. But that's because they really focused on building the stuff they needed to build, right? So they didn't let the danger of, especially an SDK that is built without user experience input from designers to holding the developers back. Developers need to hold themselves back, and this is danger. What you say, well, I can build it, might as well put it in there. But it's not free. It's going to have maintenance. It's going to have complications, it might have bug, and it might break a feature that you didn't know it's going to break, and all of those things, right?
Exactly. Even every little change that you think, this cannot be so bad, I'm just adding one new attribute to this function. Well, if that function, if we're talking about modern languages with default parameters, unless you're adding a default parameter, or if you cannot add default parameters unless you keep the original function and expand it, it's going to break your API. Breaking change means that the old applications are not going to work with a new version. In general, the mobile SDKs today, the entire build system and build ecosystem is very complex. Every time you decide, it cannot be so bad if I increment my Android Gradle plugin or my Java version. You might be breaking 10% of your users' installation, and with thousands of users, that can amount to a significant amount of folks. If you have an SDK that people are paying a license for, we're talking about real revenue that is being lost. So it's not developing an application, right, where you own the entire code, nobody's integrating, no third parties are connecting, but something that by definition is going to be shared and exposed. So the principle should be less is more, and there should be always an active effort of whether do we really need a new API, do we really need to add more complexity, any new library that you're adding, any new dependency that you're including increases your complexity. It could increase it by a factor. And I think we need to think in financial terms about this. It's going to become expensive to maintain this. Expensive means in this context either more people, taking care of your SDK, more programmers that are going to be invested here. I think particularly AI, which, well, we know it's something that everybody's talking about, it might not be very good at controlling and checking and doing sanity checks on all those things because of the entire complexity that you have. Well, we know in the Android world where we have more experience than introducing a single dependency and using it from somewhere else means that you're going to be updating your view model, your repository, your maybe you have modules that depend on another ones, and this is an entire chain reaction that can trigger. Your little change of one line might mean that many different places are broken.
To kind of complete the whole circle of SDK development, we mentioned about documentation. Documentation is super important. It's a core part of building the thing because that is the way to help your users to understand the system. Of course, the best system is something you don't need to document, right? You have to do things. I talked in a previous video about mental models. And mental model, very shortly, is something. It's a way of human beings to create a model in their head of how something works. And it's not really important that it works exactly the same way. It's just important it matches the way the interface works so you can operate the system. I think this is also looping back to how do you create the SDKs that are easy to use. Now, notoriously horrible SDK was RxJava. At some point we all had to learn to use it. And it took a long time to do. And the problem with RxJava was that it was very, very difficult to form a mental model how it works. You couldn't, as a software engineer, you couldn't simulate in your head how it goes. It was so complicated system to do. And the document that tried, all these pearls or whatever they called it, they tried to do a lot of things. But I found the documentation to be quite bad as well. It was extremely powerful. It was very difficult to learn. The learning curve was very deep. Now you compare this one to Kotlin Flows or something like that, that effectively solved the same problem. But Kotlin Flow, and you look at the documentation from JetBrains and Google, the documentation is written in a way that it's very easy to form a mental model. Now, the way flows work is not how you think they work. There's a lot of technical nuances, but you don't have to know all the technical nuances, and you still be able to use the flows because you think it's a thread, right? They isn't, right? There's a lot of more things happening in the background. But because you're able to create this mental model in your head from the documentation and experimenting with the good designed APIs, you can actually find that it's quite easy to use. And the other thing about this thing is that RxJava required you to learn a lot of things to do a small thing, right? And Flows, for example, allows you to get started with very, very small thing. And humans learn by adding information to something they already know. It's very difficult to learn new things that have no connection to existing things. So learning an SDK is a great way to learn an SDK is to get started with it, get hands dirty, and be able to do some small things. And then you can expand. Again, Firebase is a good example. You were able to save a string in there. And then you started to understand, okay, all these permission systems, all of these triggers, and all of these kind of things, you were able to add them to knowledge you already had. And that's why it was easy to learn. That's why Flows are easy to learn, relatively easy to learn. And RxJava was very difficult to learn. So I just wanted to kind of bring this up. Documentation is not just describing what your methods do, right?
You're very much on point. By the way, the flows, I think the main advantage they come over RxJava, it was the huge simplicity they have, like interface simple, and RxJava, well, was a complex API, a complex interface, and it took some time to get used to it. But to your point, I believe documentation should have several forms, not just the traditional one where you have a website that displays everything, but a few ways and a few methodologies that complement each other. For example, I find it critical to have always a sample of the SDK integration. This is typically an application that includes your SDK and offers some samples on how they get implemented and integrated. Sometimes you might need things like API keys, or you might need like activate specific features on your configuration or something that is not very straightforward. It's a little bit learning by doing. This application is here, is running. If you click on your button on your IDE, it will appear magically on your device, emulator, whatever. And that's something that, in my opinion, should be alive for every SDK. It takes a little bit also as a sanity check to make sure that what happens when we increment this version of this library or we change the build, is still working. It doesn't cover all the use cases, but it's some sort of foundational stone for your project. So that's for me probably number one. Then in-code documentation, all the IDEs we're using today, call them the ones from JetBrains, Xcode, are smart enough to access the in-code documentation. That was not the case with previous IDEs like 15 or 20 years ago, where you needed to go to the Java docs page that was uploaded somewhere. But now you can, hover your cursor and read the documentation and understand what every parameter is doing, and if there is any nuance that you need to be aware of, such as, if you change this parameter to this thing, that other part is going to stop working, this one will get activated, etc. I like also to have a centralized piece of documentation, a sort of get me started with this in 3 or 5 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever you need. It's typically an open source project, a README file, where you have the, you need to add this library, this is how you initialize it, this is the 3-4 key aspects that you need, an API key, maybe in adding a plugin on your code base that initializes the entire SDK. But that's something that you read first, right? Like when you're integrating an SDK, if you have documentation and your initialization or the relevant aspects are buried within, like 3 or 4 different chapters, it's going to be hard, because you need okay, I'm reading this first page, I still don't know how to get this thing done, how to get it integrated. So I just want, be a little bit economical and look like, okay, I take a look here, 30 seconds, I know where can I download the SDK, how to get it integrated, and then I get into more advanced steps when I need it.
Binds into the idea of start, so you can learn something, you can add into what you already learned, right? Mm-hmm. But you have to get to 0.0 first. I've seen some of open source projects where the getting started documentation is very long and it includes a lot of shell scripts or something, and when the second script fails, that's it. You don't know. There's a lot of things we can talk about documentation. One aspect I think it would be interesting, another episode is talking about that LLMs are used to learn. How do you write documentation to serve LLMs? The other thing, one more thing is related to what I said, is about error handling or error reporting is part of documentation. Especially if you have any initialization scripts or anything like that, you can't just go, okay, missing library. Okay, what then? What do you do then? Anything's falling. But I think that's a very good place to maybe wrap it up. We're going to talk about these different areas when we get to it. We're going to do multiple episodes about SDK development in general. If there's anything that the audience would like to hear, if you want to hear about certain aspect of our experience of what we've been doing, or areas in general in SDK development, just write a comment and we'll get to it.
Yeah, let's do that. It's a super large topic. We were talking about it as we were thinking about talking about SDKs. So yeah, we can easily expand a lot into API design, documentation, hosting, automation. I think it's a super interesting topic for SDK. So yeah, let us your comment, your opinion, and we'll be happy to take it over from there.
Cool. That's all for today. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye-bye.